Also this week, extending those expiring tax cuts. The Senate took care of that last week, and an overall review of the tax code for possible restructuring. The Senate today is continuing debate on cybersecurity legislation, which sets voluntary standards to regulate Internet traffic. Live coverage of that debate now on C-SPAN 2, and now to the House floor here on C-SPAN.
House will be in order. The Chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., July 31st, 2012. I hereby appoint the Honorable Steve Womack to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 17, 2012, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each, but in no event shall debate continue beyond 1:50 p.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jones, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Again, I try to get to the floor once a week to talk about our failed policy in Afghanistan. Last Thursday, an article in the Politico reminded us of the difficulty trying to change a culture like Afghanistan. It is nearly impossible. For centuries, outside influences have been trying, but we are never going to be able to change the belief systems and culture of the Middle East. The Politico article stated that parts of Afghanistan were stuck in the 14th century. We're supporting a corrupt country and a culture where it is commonplace for grown men to have sexual relations with young boys. The American taxpayers should be outraged to know that their tax dollars are going to support this kind of practice. Yesterday, the Washington Post published an article titled U.S. Construction Projects in Afghanistan Challenged by Inspector General's report. While discussing the fact that projects implemented in Afghanistan by Americans will not be possible for the Afghans to sustain once the United States leaves, the question for policymakers in Washington is whether the massive influx of American spending in Afghanistan is actually making the problem worse. One such project to provide electricity requires purchasing diesel fuel to run the generators enough to power about 2,500 Afghan homes or small businesses. Is projected to cost the United States taxpayer about $220 million through 2013. I mean, Mr. Speaker, it's just billions and billions and billions and billions going to Afghanistan and very little accountability. And yet we're cutting programs for the American people. I don't know, to me it makes no sense at all. Mr. Speaker, again, I brought this a poster down. This is a new one that I purchased myself. Mr. Speaker, there's a little girl holding her mother's arm. The mother's being escorted by an Army officer. And the little girl is looking at the case sign that's carrying her father. Her father is under an American flag. The father was killed in Afghanistan for America. I would say to this family, and you should be very proud of your father, I would say to Congress, why can't you understand that you've got a failed policy in Afghanistan and these young men and women are dying, these young men and women are losing their legs and arms, and yet we keep sending $10 billion a month to a corrupt leader where they have the practice of adults, men making love with boys over there in Afghanistan. I just don't understand the Congress, to be honest with you. Mr. Speaker, as you know and many know, I have Camp Lejeune Marine Base in my district, and in the last 10 days, 3 Marines have been killed in Afghanistan. I salute their families and thank them for the gift of that loved one. How many more young men and women have to die in Afghanistan? How many more taxpayers' dollars have to go to prop up a corrupt leader? Afghanistan will not survive under Karzai. The Taliban will eventually take over. And Mr. Speaker, before closing, as I always do, first I'd like to ask the American people to contact their members of Congress and say, bring our troops home now, at least no later than 2014, and stop spending our taxpayers' money when you can't even account for what it's being spent for in Afghanistan, and start spending it right here in America and build our roads, schools, and infrastructure. So on behalf of this little girl and her mom and all the families who've given loved ones dying for freedom in Afghanistan, I will close this way. God, please bless our men and women in uniform. God, please bless the families of our men and women in uniform. God, in your loving arms, hold the families who've given a child dying for freedom in Afghanistan and Iraq. God, please bless the House and Senate that we will do what is right in God's eyes for the people of today and the people of tomorrow. And ask God to please bless the President of the United States to give him wisdom, courage, and strength to do what's right for God's people here. And 3 times I will say, God, please, God, please, God, please continue to bless America. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The Chair recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, sometimes schoolyard bullies pick on the wrong kid. Anti-choice forces thought they had found a cheap way to make a large point against the right of women in our country to reproductive health and choice. So they picked on the District of Columbia. Pick a fight with the District of Columbia. After all, the District of Columbia doesn't have a vote, even if the bill is about only the District of Columbia. But in the process, they picked a fight with the women of the United States, because this is still a pro-choice nation. Now, they didn't want to get women worked up in an election year, but they wanted a federal imprimatur, a federal label. So they thought they could get the House to pass a bill, it's coming to the floor today on suspension, that women in the District of Columbia are not entitled to an abortion pre-viability at 20 weeks. Mind you, everywhere else in the United States that right still would exist. And while they're at it, they say, look, let's penalize women by allowing an injunction against an abortion by these women by anybody, any caretaker who's had anything to do with them anywhere, any time in their life. I guess the elementary school nurse could come in to seek an injunction. And, of course, penalize doctors, 2 years in jail and a fine. No health exception for the woman, no matter her health or fetal abnormality. No rape, incest exception. One of my constituents, Professor Christy Zink, had an abortion at 21 weeks, the earliest time her physicians discovered that she was carrying a fetus with half a brain. Had it been born alive at all, it would have had constant seizures. She would have had to carry that fetus to term. Sometimes bullies pick the wrong fight. Anti-choice forces have threatened our leadership here, and particularly Republicans, saying they're going to score the vote. All that did was to bring out the really big boys, Planned Parenthood and pro-choice NARAL, who are going to score it as well. They've been too clever by 2/3. It'll take 2/3 to pass this bill. I'm hoping that you won't get that kind of supermajority. This is not the typical anti-home rule bill that holds everyone else harmless except D.C. residents and the D.C. government. This bill is a key element in a state-by-state campaign that seeks first to undermine and then to eliminate reproductive choice and health for women across the United States. They've miscalculated. They have reinvigorated the pro-choice movement. They have, just as they did when they infiltrated the Susan B. Komen race for the cure and forced Coleman to do a reverse take and continue to give to Planned Parenthood, just as they did when they failed to defund Planned Parenthood, just as they did when they caused a furor by women with the attack on contraceptives in health care policies. Now people see this fight against reproductive choice for what it is, because it is ended with the constitutional right to abortion. They have abandoned all their principles, because if they feel so deeply, how could they have put a bill in that would affect only women and only fetuses in the District of Columbia? The Supreme Court decided 39 years ago that a woman is entitled to an abortion. That's a constitutional right. It's not a constitutional right everywhere except the nation's capital. The differences in our country on choice are great, but they are differences we all must respect. And the Supreme Court has settled those differences with Roe versus Wade, which says pre-viability, this is between a woman and her doctor. After viability, of course, there are some things that can be done, but the health of the mother always has to be a large factor. This bill stretches beyond any penalty any doctors in our country would have received, any penalty on women, and it is the kind of bill that sends a message to women: this is not a house that is protecting your reproductive health. If this bill passes, it will cause the kind of uproar that we have not seen in almost 40 years.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Dreyer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, nearly 3 decades ago, one of my great heroes, Ronald Reagan, famously said, "In all of the arsenals of the world, no weapon is so powerful as the will and moral courage of free men and women." For the last year and a half, no development on the world stage has drawn greater interest or sparked more passionate debate than the upheaval in the Arab world. What started in Tunisia in December of 2010 has spread throughout North Africa and the Middle East, leaving virtually no Arab nation untouched. Tunisia ousted a dictator and elected a constituent assembly which is drafting a new constitution. Libya fought a civil war, rid itself of its dictators, and held elections. In both cases, particularly in Libya, blood was shed, but it has so far not been in vain, as real hope for democracy and an improved quality of life prevails. Other countries, such as Morocco and Jordan, have seen more modest changes, but in the same direction, toward greater openness. Elsewhere in the Arab world, this unprecedented chain of events has thus far taken a far more tragic path. The Syrian people are suffering immeasurably for their efforts to unseat a regime that has proven itself eager to take innocent lives in brutal fashion. In countries like Bahrain, the violence has been more limited but no less tragic. Even in those nations where regimes stifle public discourse, we know that the autocrats are watching. They are mindful of Reagan's lesson that the will of the people cannot be suppressed indefinitely. Of all the nations where this movement has unfolded, none holds greater sway over the future of the region than Egypt. Since the stunning fall of Mubarak in February of last year, Egypt has held parliamentary and presidential elections. Both sets of elections swept the Muslim Brotherhood to office, setting up a power struggle between the Brotherhood's leadership, the secularists, and the military council. Knowing of the harsh and deeply troubling rhetoric the Brotherhood has used over the years, many Americans rightly ask the question, can we work with the newly elected leadership in Egypt? Should we continue to provide support to this government and the Egyptian people? What exactly does the Brotherhood stand for, and how will they lead? Mr. Speaker, these are important questions. To answer them, we have to go beyond the reactionary and reductionist assumptions that are often made. I've spent a great deal of time in Egypt meeting with staunch secularists to Salafists and everyone in between, including leaders and members of the Muslim Brotherhood. What I have found is a vast movement that is far from monolithic. It is made up of moderates and hardliners, reformers and the old guard, and great internal differences exist. One thing, however, that has unified them is their public statements of support for the Camp David peace accords, for human rights, including women's rights, as well as religious freedom, all of which are prerequisites to meet their quest to get their economy back on track through tourism and international investment. I've joined with a Democratic colleague in introducing a resolution calling for a free trade agreement with Egypt to help achieve just that. Ultimately, we will judge them not by their words, as Secretary Clinton has just said in a piece, but by their actions. But the mere fact that these public statements have been made says a great deal about the stark difference between the nature of an underground movement, which the Muslim Brotherhood was, and an elected government. Now that the Brotherhood has at least taken some of the responsibility of righting the economy and providing opportunity for 85 million Egyptians, it will face enormous pressure to pursue a reform agenda, engage appropriately with the West, and eschew regional conflict. In the meantime, Mr. Speaker, we as Americans have a responsibility to live up to our own ideals. How can we preach democracy yet shun the free and fair choices of Egyptians? Of course, we cannot be naive. We have to recognize that democracy is about more than just elections, but also about protecting minority rights and building institutions that outlast the individuals who occupy them. But we also have to recognize that supporting only democracies around the world that produce our own preferred results is the height of hypocrisy. On a more practical level, compromising our own values would only strengthen the hands of anti-Western fundamentalists. Refusing to engage with the Muslim Brotherhood would simply achieve a self-fulfilling prophecy by giving rise to extremists over reformists and moderates. No country following decades of authoritarian rule can make a full transition to a thriving, stable, peaceful, and prosperous democracy quickly and painlessly. Even with the most optimistic of outlooks, the Egyptian people will struggle for years to come to throw off the shackles of the past and create the kind of future for which we all strive. We've been working at this for 236 years, Mr. Speaker, and we still haven't gotten it exactly right. We have a responsibility as longtime Egyptian allies and as champions of democracy around the globe to stand with them in this process, encouraging continued reform and providing our support for the development of real democracy in the Arab world's most populous nation.
The Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Miller, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the Honoring America's Veterans and Caring for Camp Lejeune Families Act, which the House will consider later today, especially Title I, the Janie Ensminger Act. Title I and a similar House bill honor a 9-year-old girl who died from childhood leukemia, most likely because she was exposed to contaminated drinking water at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, when her mother was pregnant with her. And by honoring Janie Ensminger, we honor those Americans who have shown remarkable determination to make their government do the right thing. They have struggled for more than a decade to learn exactly what chemicals were in the drinking water at Camp Lejeune, water that perhaps 1 million Marines and their families were exposed to over a 30-year period, to learn the health effects of exposure to the contaminated drinking water, and to seek justice for those harmed. They took on their own government, including the Marine Corps that they had served and to which they are still loyal, but which has been shamefully reluctant to accept responsibility for the water contamination. Janie's father, Jerry Ensminger, is a retired Marine who lived with his family on base at Camp Lejeune for a time. Jerry watched his daughter become ill from leukemia, struggle with the disease, and eventually lose the struggle. Years after he watched his daughter die, Jerry learned of the water contamination at Camp Lejeune and has not rested since. I first met Jerry 4 years ago when he testified powerfully before the Science and Technology Committee's Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight, which I then chaired. Jerry worked shoulder to shoulder with others, including Tom Townsend, Mike Partain, Jim Fontella, the Byron family, and William Hill against long odds. The Janey Ensminger Act is the result of their remarkable efforts. They were always faithful to the cause of justice for those harmed by the contaminated drinking water. The Janey Ensminger Act will require the VA to provide medical coverage for certain illnesses to veterans who served at Camp Lejeune between 1957 and 1987 and to their families. The VA will be the payer of last resort. Justice requires no less for the people harmed by the water contamination at Camp Lejeune. The harm will never be fully made right. The bill will not help Janey or her father, but the Janey Ensminger Act acknowledges responsibility and provides needed treatment for many others. The Marines who have championed this legislation served our democracy when they wore our nation's uniform, and they served our democracy by their determination to obtain justice for the people harmed by the toxic drinking water at Camp Lejeune. I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, we have heard a lot about fairness from the President lately. Perhaps his Chicago advisors think that if he distracts, divides, and creates envy, all in the name of so-called fairness, Americans will ignore their thin wallets and stacked up bills. But the people are smarter than backroom government policycrats. If the President is reelected in January, he will have inherited a weak economy from his predecessor, himself. Then who will he blame? The President was elected to solve problems, not place blame and make excuses for failure. But like most Americans, I want the administration to succeed. But the evidence is not on the administration's side. With unemployment higher than 8% for 41 months, even higher for recent college graduates, above 50%, and our deficit above $15 trillion, there isn't much of a record to stand on. So we are involved in a new Madison Avenue campaign diversion called Remake America, to make America fair. Of course, fairness is in the eyes of the beholder, and it means different things to different folks. But it certainly sounds good at first glance. Mr. Speaker, let's look at this idea. The politics of fairness are used when politicians want you to ignore their record and then claim that some people just haven't been treated fairly. This is a mere diversion from failed policy, failed ideas. When you look at the record, you'll see that this administration's definition of fairness really means favoritism. There's no fairness in crony capitalism. That is favoritism. There is no fairness in a perpetual bailout culture where the omnipotent government deems some too big to fail and others too small to succeed. That is favoritism. There is no fairness in forcing Americans to fork over money to pay for failed pet endeavors like Solyndra. That is favoritism. There is no fairness in an unaccountable government that constantly takes money from the working people and squanders it in a failed stimulus or two. That is favoritism. And there's no fairness in enforcing some laws while proudly ignoring other laws. That is favoritism. What this fairness debate or the politics of favoritism achieves is a systematic desire by government to create animosity. Animosity toward those who have or just trying to achieve some success. It also creates animosity toward government from those who built it on their own without being a member of the government's favored class. This debate degrades the American dream because it removes the equality of opportunity and creates a class of favorites, the class of government friends. There is no equality or fairness in forced equal outcomes. Since some people are more successful than others, to paraphrase Lincoln, the government, which cannot make everyone rich, is trying to accomplish what it can do, make everyone poor, and dependent on the government for success. This is fairness? I think not. Instead of encouraging individuals to succeed on their own, this administration tells citizens that they need the government. In fact, according to the Wall Street Journal, almost 50% of the population lives in a household where at least one member receives a government benefit. Bad policies have forced more Americans to grow dependent on government. The President wants to, in his own words, remake America. Remake it into what? A nation where the government is running roughshod over our lives and our liberty? A country where no one is allowed to succeed unless the government gives permission? No thanks. I thought we threw that idea away when we left the regime of King George III. America doesn't need to be remade into a third world country totally oppressed by a government that wants America to be another European nanny state where special favoritism is given to government's special friends. We need to return to what our country was founded on, the pursuit of opportunity. Or as Jefferson said it, the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The American dream, a dream that can come true with individualism and hard work, and without a government that punishes ambition, creativity, and success while rewarding failure, all in the name of fairness. The politics of favoritism under the guise of fairness is not the America we need. Mr. Speaker, the America I know doesn't need to be remade into the politics of favoritism. And that's just the way it is. I yield back.
The Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Bass, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor the life of a friend and a remarkable individual from Los Angeles, Willis Edwards. For the past 40 years, Mr. Edwards tirelessly advocated for civil and political rights and worked to ensure that positive images of African Americans were seen by the American public. Throughout his life, Willis Edwards was known for his strength of conviction and passion for the promotion of the African American community. After working for the Robert Kennedy presidential campaign in college and earning a Bronze Star in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War, Edwards helped to elect the first African-American mayor of Los Angeles, Tom Bradley, and he served as the youngest ever city commissioner on his Social Services Commission. Mr. Edwards continued his career of service as the Director of Black Student Services at the University of Southern California, where he helped future generations of students discover their passion. In 1982, Mr. Edwards was elected president of the Beverly Hills Hollywood branch of the NAACP. Under his leadership, the branch fought to improve the image and gain more jobs for African Americans in front of and behind the scenes in Hollywood. As president in 1986, he helped to nationally televise the NAACP Image Awards, which continues today as a highly regarded entertainment event. Mr. Edwards never shied away from controversial subjects or issues. After his diagnosis with AIDS, he used his position on the national board of the NAACP to publicly discuss the impact of HIV/AIDS in the African American community, and he organized the NAACP's participation in World AIDS Day. Despite his health challenges, Mr. Edwards continued to support his friends and communities. Until Rosa Parks' death in 2002, Mr. Edwards was a friend and confidant of the civil rights legend. He helped to promote her legacy by escorting her to the 1998 Oscar ceremony and worked alongside former Congresswoman Julia Carson for Parks to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. Upon her death, Edwards arranged for her to lie in state here in the Capitol Rotunda. Mr. Speaker, I am proud to have called Willis Edwards a friend and a mentor. He has left an indelible mark on Los Angeles, and his dedication to California and national politics will never be forgotten. It is a great honor to recognize his life here on the floor today. His spirit and vision will truly be missed. I yield back the balance of my time.
Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until 2 p.m. today.
When the House returns at 2 Eastern, members will consider 19 bills, including stemming abuse of government credit cards and further limits on abortions in the District of Columbia.